Preparing the live stream. Sending your meeting to YouTube live, which I guess is different now.
Yeah, it actually does go live pretty automatically. So I think we've been live for like 5 to 10 seconds.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So just like don't look at it because it's
So there's a bit of a delay. So what I usually do is I'll just keep looking at the Zoom screen and put the YouTube window off to the side and just not look at it.
Yeah. Good idea. All right. Well, I've got the Zoom up. Thanks, Collin, for helping me navigate that.
Yeah, totally. And I'm happy to show you later too. It took me a while to figure this shit out too.
Yeah. So here we are, live streaming. If anybody's seeing this, congratulations. All right. So the reason for this little get together. So Collin and I were chatting about some kind of things that have been interesting to us lately about sort of the confluence of religion and technology and some other things that are sort of happening in contemporary life, and some of the things that are kind of salient in those spheres, and sometimes they're more interesting and sometimes less interesting. But one thing that certainly was more prevalent to a lot more people in the past was this idea that the environment is trying to tell you something, or that coincidences, while they might be just literal coincidences, doesn't mean that they don't carry meaning and that they can't have impacts on your day-to-day life. So this would be signs, things either personal to you or writ large, like, solar eclipses or volcanic eruptions. These things would probably coordinate large groups of people, smaller ones, maybe not so much. But I took that on as almost like a challenge to what would happen if I turned my attention to something like this for a week and then just sort of recorded what happens. So that was about a week ago.
Oh, amazing. And you took notes?
I took notes. So I have some I have some signs. And I entitled this little chat. So it's a combination of two sayings. So I think that what is this? So trials and tribulations are the two things that go together. I think that's from Revelations. In like signs and portents or something else. Signs actually goes with something else, but I mixed them together on purpose to sort of give this idea of a lot of the times what we see in signs or revelations is or at least for me, they tend to be negative or troubling. Anyway, not always, but sometimes.
Right. They're like some sort of cosmic warning.
Yeah. Exactly. So maybe let's start, Collin, getting some of your thoughts on this idea of signs and what it kind of means to sort of modern people and how you've been thinking about this in the last, recently.
Yeah. So I think the context that I've been thinking about it in most recently has been in this sort of game B context. Like there's a lot of language that has surfaced in those sorts of conversations with Jordan Hall and Jim Rutt, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and others. Mm-hmm. And there's this sort of meme about sense making.
Yeah.
And to me, it seems like signs, like you said earlier, are referring to things in your immediate environment, things that you can pick up with your five senses. And if you never are questioning the meanings you're making around particular things that you see, then you don't have free will. And maybe, you, I think going too deep into the free will conversation is not that interesting to me, but you can get to a point where you're actually having some sense of possibility or choice when you're able to look at signs and imagine new possibilities or meaning making from them. And another piece of this context is that there are many distractions in modern life that we sort of outsource our sense-making capacity to. Mm-hmm. And these might be called the oracles. Like if you just watch the news all the time, like that's an oracle. They're interpreting the signs that are happening. You see video image of fires in Australia. And you see that, and then but there's also this overlay on top of it. You're getting the news anchors or this large organization's sort of sense making stamp on top of that.
Yeah.
So this is the distinction maybe between signs and symbols. And symbols are maybe more sort of abstract concepts, and maybe you trust the way that symbols are being interpreted by an organization like the news or your parents, right? Maybe your parents, you have just sort of, you haven't gotten to the point where you question the way that your parents told you the way the world is and your place in it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So I'm thinking about signs in the context of like how you can pay more attention to signs. And I'm really curious to hear what you took notes on this past week. So how you make sense of signs, what you're noticing in your day-to-day life, and what you're doing about it. Are you making changes in your life? Are you, interpreting them in a way that helps you achieve a new goal or something like that?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so I think it is important to realize also that if you direct your attention to something, we're pattern matching kind of machines, really. And if you pay attention to whatever you consider a sign to be, for some period of time, you're almost guaranteed to see them or perceive them or something like that. So I didn't expect not to see them. I was more or less just curious about what I would see. And I generally try in my sort of day-to-day life to be more perceptive about what it is that's happening around me, and to put meaning more on what's happening in my environment, mostly because, like what you were saying with these oracles, it seems like in times past, when there were fewer oracles, it was easier to sort of put more trust in them. I think people kind of knew that the oracles weren't perfect, but for the most part, there was a few that you could generally count on, and we could sort of make quite a lot of meaning together as like a very large group, either as a country or a city or a state or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's definitely not the case anymore. I mean, I don't think anybody would say that they're like, yeah, I have a really solid line on what's going on and I feel really well informed, and the only alternative to, like, if you don't trust oracles, well, you have to do the work yourself. And that's just not tractable. Like, I cannot become an expert in all of the things I might need to know about. And neither would I have the ability to see them firsthand. The only thing I have direct access to, for the most part, is like literally what's around me and who I know and what I know about them. And this is not enough to make sense of the world. I'll say that. But it's enough to sort of make sense of my local environment, and it gives me some sense of grounding. So I do think it's important in that respect.
And I think you've hit something really important, and it's the who I know piece.
Yeah,
you have
become much more important.
You have your immediate environment around you, and then you have that group of people who you are participating in the act of making sense of the world with.
Right. Choose them carefully.
Choose them carefully. Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And what I also mean by that is, like, if you found someone or someone comes to you that you're like, I'm not sure about this, you don't have to be a jerk and be like, hey, you're not good for my sense making, get out of here. You just don't, you pay less attention to them, because most likely, or I mean, if you're like me, the sense making that I do is still largely digital. I mean, my immediate family is my family, but how I figure things out is largely mediated by people sort of online. And I can really, I have a lot of ways at which I can sort of direct my attention online.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like, I've been thinking about that, digital sense making versus embodied sense making, and what gets lost when I spend too much of my energy making sense online in a digital space, and not enough investing in in-person relationships. I've definitely been thinking about that.
That's a good point. So I just got back from an offsite with my coworkers, and I'm a remote employee. So this was actually the first time I'd met many of them in person.
Oh.
And I can say that there is absolutely a categorical difference between doing things in person and doing things virtual. It's just the virtual is so much more convenient We have so much more access, and there's less restrictions overall, but the bandwidth literally is just a lot less. So when you're in person with people, I guess it might help to think about it like you can use online tools to help you filter by some degrees or measures, like what places you choose to put your body. Like, do you choose to go to a conference, or do you choose to go to a meetup where you're going to interact with some of these people? Because once you do that, the sort of the level of coherence that you're going to get with those people is much higher. And is absolutely necessary if you're actually trying to do something in the world. So if you're trying to take the sense that you've made and put that into some sort of decision making, you do definitely need to be in person at least some part of the time. I think anyway.
Yeah. I that feels true to me. I'm sure there are many examples of people who that's not true for.
Yeah,
or
and
maybe people that don't that don't have like embodied connections as high on their like stack.
Well, that plus remember, it's not as easy. Some people really do like to be in social situations, and some don't.
Yeah.
Right. And for some people, it's much easier to get your socializing done in an impersonal way because it's actually difficult to do it in person. And I end up working with a lot of these folks because they happen to have a lot of other talents and gifts that make it really, relevant to technology. So, there is that to be said. Plus, it just seems like, the prevalence of what we call maybe the spectrum, or people who have difficulty reading other people's faces and picking up on social cues, but then have all these other aptitudes and interests. That seems to be a growing thing, like it becoming a larger part of the population.
Yeah.
So what to do with that, I don't know, but even still, I think it is absolutely beneficial, even if it's difficult for you to relate to people in person, to occasionally, get out of your shell and do it.
Yeah. Are there? I think this exists in many different forms. In the most probably the most well known, it would be a job title under the like broad heading of coaching, but the position would basically be operating under the premise that social intelligence is actually essential for success. Being able to communicate effectively and work well in groups, even if it's at a minimal level in like a remote tech job. But if that's true, that you need some baseline of social intelligence, and if you actually have somebody to help you design practices and how to upregulate that, it seems like that sort of position is going to be more common, or the people that are good at it probably do really well at it.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's very related to kind of the point of this conversation is it's some of those same skills, but instead of pointed towards another person, pointed at the environment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So what's the tribulation piece? I'm curious.
Well,
you unpack that a little more.
That was more of a so for me, a lot of what colors my sort of sense making is sort of larger issues of sense making, actually. So in terms of like, what does it mean to have, or to have different ideas about what's going on around and what's happening? And to maybe make it real concrete as an example, I was trying to come up with an example of what this means and how it sort of feels to me. So memes online, and memes is kind of strictly defined as like some piece of popular culture with text. So there's lots of other kinds of memes, but let's strictly define what I'm talking about for in this particular situation is that. Now you can imagine that, let's say on Twitter or some other social network, you could have a whole conversation between multiple people with nothing but memes,
Mhm.
right? Like no additional context, no talking, no nothing. It's just one pop clip with some text after another. And everybody will have this mental construction about what that conversation means.
Mhm.
Mostly because in pop culture, which is still relatively unified because it's not political, so to speak. If you've seen that movie, you understand that meme, kind of a thing.
Right. So like
And still
Marvel movies and Star Wars.
Exactly. All that stuff most of us in this culture still understand, or at least have some idea about what it means when that image is shown. And there might be some additional context with the text that goes along with that, and some creativity as well.
Although those examples I just gave are maybe becoming more political with like
certainly
just like the kind of banal culture war arguments about like representation and stuff.
Right. And that's slightly off, that's a little bit different too. So where I'm going with this though is, let's say that conversation amongst many people eventually starts becoming more and more esoteric. Like the shots become more obscure from different movies, and occasionally you're like, I don't know what that means. But then you kind of jump back in after it kind of comes back to something you understand and recognize. Right. So there's this sense of this, you could almost think about it as a metric of coherence amongst the group. And the larger the divide between what it is that you understand this conversation to mean and what it is I understand it to mean, amongst all the dimensions of how many people are listening or watching, the further that diverges, right? You can think of that as becoming like more and more out of sync or out of sort of in touch. But you're still having this conversation because you don't quite realize how far things are out of sync just yet. But then you start to feel it. You start to really feel like I don't really get what's going on here. And maybe you have some out of band conversation with somebody else, and you're like, yeah, that's not at all what I was taking away from this. And it becomes more and more clear over time that most people aren't thinking the same thing, right? And it starts to become where it used to be fun and what used to be a really meaningful conversation now becomes either threatening or because you don't understand what's going on, right? And that's kind of where it feels like our society is at this point, with so many more ways of like communicating and making sense, that this is the thing that's actually kind of happening writ large. And then the question is, well, what's going to happen after, or what's happening either now or after this sort of phase that we're in? And that's the thing that's unanswered. I don't know. I don't know how this thing would either coalesce around new meanings or fall apart or something else. But that was the kind of tribulations in my head that I was kind of working with.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you just said, and I feel like that's where a work around a grand narrative, I think, becomes more relevant, because the more and more people feel that tension that you mentioned of, having all these different ways of making sense, and everyone is coming to different conclusions, and it's hard to find sort of a foundation to agree on. The mythologies and stories that start to weave in kind of a larger purpose to it all, and some directionality, then people will start to perk up. Like what if young engineers look at their future and ask, like, what am I building for? Who is it for? What is it for? Why? How come? And if there's a compelling story about creating systems that help people cooperate better, feel more belonging, be a part of a tribe again, like those stories are going to start to be really appealing to people.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. And I think, there's some hints that this is already sort of happening. There's this idea that there's, at least on Twitter, a community, you can call it like crypto Twitter. I'm a part of crypto Twitter, but there's no link to crypto Twitter. Like I can't direct you to it. Right? It's actually a group of people connected in a particular way. It's changing all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And I didn't go to Twitter. You can't go there. You have to sort of like slowly integrate it. But it's also, there's just way weird stuff coming out of all the other places of Twitter.
Yeah.
And it ends up being mostly just about, yelling at each other about one thing or another.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel all that, comfortable or nice or like a home.
Yeah.
But I still want to be able to talk with people. I just need a little bit more safety than Twitter. Actually, a lot more.
A lot more safety. Totally. Yeah. And does something like Urbit, is that what you were thinking of as something that can to adjust to that lack of safety that you feel?
Oh, certainly. That's exactly what Urbit is for. Urbit is for creating groups of people to live together. Not exclusively, meaning you don't have to be in just one or the other, but it's not connected in the same way like Twitter is, where you can just sort of fly through the Twitterverse and who knows where you're going to land. It's kind of more invite only, or I should say the invite, the permissions are first, sort of like their first person, or they're very much higher in the stack than most other web tech. And so because you can choose how you want to create, you can create a completely open group. I mean, most of them are right now. But eventually, I would estimate the ones that are the most meaningful are going to be the ones that are probably semi-local, meaning you actually know these people in real life. And, you do something together. Like it's an actual meaningful group and you just need a place to be. And then, eventually over time, it's like, well, why do I need some of these other places where I'm just going to get harassed? Like if you have a Twitter clone inside of, Urbit or any of these others, platforms that are sort of allowing people to create their own safe spaces, most of the time that'll probably be good enough.
Yeah. Who would you say are the winners on Twitter right now?
Oh, anyone that can get the most attention, however that is, right? It's an attention game, and it feels good to get attention. It really does. Except for me, at least, when it turns sour and negative, I really dislike that. I have a visceral response to that. So I avoid it quite strictly, which is to say, I don't engage in combative conversation on Twitter. If I'm going to reply to you, it's because I liked what you did. I don't reply to things I don't like. And it's and a lot of times it's people I know. So I have made this little bubble around myself on Twitter, but that's really, it's difficult to do.
Yeah, totally. I've generally done the same. And I feel like my Twitter follower count grows slowly. And it is the people that are coming to it are like we're tuned in some like pretty fundamental way.
Yeah.
Common interests, reading similar people, talk about similar things. But every once in a while, this has happened to me maybe 2 or 3 times where a tweet will go outside of my bubble, like it'll get retweeted or liked by someone who has an opening into this whole other network. And it can be jarring sometimes getting trolls paying attention to you.
Yeah, it certainly is, because it feels like somebody's yelling at you in person, and all of those fight or flight symptoms kick in. Like you actually, your body is fearing for its own safety, and that's really hard to deal with. Especially since you're like sitting in a chair, like in front of a laptop, and that's like not actually that threatening.
Yeah, I feel like my tune is changing a little bit as far as like being willing to be antagonistic on the internet. Like I've been trying to create this distinction between like being edgy for edginess's sake, of just like poking someone's soft underbelly just to be a dick. That's one thing. And then the other is really feeling strongly or passionately about an opinion or idea that might be unpopular with a large group of people, and then standing by it.
How do you frame that comment when you do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's usually like I mean, the context I'm thinking of is still specifically Twitter, and the like tone of tweets sometimes changes for me. Like sometimes it'll be like I'll be like speaking authentically and making a point that I feel is true or true from my partial perspective. Another time it might be like semi-sarcastic, but there's like an element of truth behind it. It depends on the tone. It depends on the tone. But I think the point I'm trying to make is like, not like when I do feel that's kind of like fight or flight response based on some shit someone says to me on the internet. Not succumbing to it, and not like just not walking away from potential conflict just because it's uncomfortable. And being like, ooh, what if I stand up for this thing that I said? What will happen then? And then following that thread. And I don't know. I want to be somebody that is experimenting with new ideas, and also like not being afraid to like stand up for them. And if they're proven wrong, like being humble and admitting where I was wrong. But not being a pushover about it. It's kind of this, it's a new little thing I'm trying on.
And I suppose I do that occasionally, probably less often, but I do, with character space willing, try to make it clear when I do respond, if I'm standing up for a particular belief, that this comment is not directed at this person as an attack, or I'm not saying they're dumb or wrong or anything else like that. I'm just expressing something, or maybe to say it like this, I think it's important to be polite.
Yeah, I agree with you to a certain extent.
And that's okay.
I feel like politeness it is very applicable in some contexts. Of course, I'm going to be polite to like people I love and trust and know. But sometimes when politeness is like the overarching frame that is dictating how I behave, it kind of like suppresses some of my life force. Like it might come out in like a kind of crazy way, and fine, like that's great. Like I like to feel more alive, and if politeness like puts me in too big of a or too small of a box, then I don't know, like I want to question it. I want to be like, why am I being polite in this moment? Like, what am I afraid of, really?
And I think that's completely legitimate. And maybe from my perspective, I do it because it's counterculture. People are not polite online. If you are, you're a weirdo.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I like that.
And maybe that's my sort of stick, because I know my motivations and why I'm doing it. Nobody else does necessarily. And I'm not saying your approach is, one way or another. That's obviously, this is for me.
Yeah.
I'm polite most of the time. I'm not going to say all the time, but I also do it almost as a little point of defiance because very few other people do it.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. I think that's beautiful. I think we all have to find our own ways of doing things. Plus, I was thinking about this the other day, the difference between imitating somebody, which I think is deeply human, versus copying somebody.
Well,
like
okay.
Imitation. I think imitation is like being a child and watching how adults do things and trying it on in your own context, like seeing what that feels like. But there's still like it's coming from your own source. Whereas copying, I think you're you're outsourcing much more of your capacity, and you're trying to do it exactly like that person. So you're ignoring you're ignoring information that your own system is telling you because you think it's better to do it this way, and that person's doing it well. So I'm going to just try and copy everything they do. Like that to me is not authentic.
Yeah. But there's a real, I mean, there's a fine line. It seems like could be a fine line there.
Yeah.
Or at least for me, it would be difficult to know exactly, which side of that I might land on. But I generally agree that I think we all do this as humans, is sort of, we see other people doing something and then we do that same thing. But to do it out of a way that's more sort of informed by your own experience is more authentic.
Right. Yeah. I think maybe this is an example, like if you're a man and you feel like you lack structure and discipline, you might try and imitate somebody like Jocko, or, maybe you're really inspired by somebody who is really into jujitsu, or like a Stoic philosophy. Yeah. So you might read things that they write and watch interviews with them and kind of learn about how they're doing things and try and imitate a structure that might work for you. And that to me is different than trying to copy exactly what they do, because you're never going to be able to have the same life circumstances as these people ever. So you can try and imitate a structure, but ultimately what you have to also do is be more present to your own context and do it your way.
So if I could give an example there. So say if I was a man and I was feeling like I need to have more classical masculine traits. Like I feel demasculated somehow, which I think is a very prevalent feeling for a lot of men in our culture right now. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's the way we feel. And so we latch onto some examples, maybe like you were saying, a Joe Rogan or some of these other folks, right? Or, sort of like the MMA style ways of doing athletics, like really serious, like, there's blood involved kind of a thing. Yeah. So that piques our interest and we watch that, and we're trying to bring some of those characteristics onto ourselves, but we're not really sure how. So we sign up for a gym membership and then we kick ourselves because we never go. And then we start like lifting weights or something, but it really hurts because it's an old shoulder injury or whatever. And it just doesn't seem to be working at all. And then, you just sort of ditch it. But maybe what you should have done is like picked up your old sneakers from your cross country days and gone for a run to get those endorphins back up again. And all that means is, in this example, running was the way in which to re-express your masculinity, because it was, one, not going to hurt you. Two, it was something you're already good at. Like, don't try to be something you're not, but it's the same kind of feeling of like, I need to do something and I need to bring this onto myself. And yes, you should, like, but do it. Yeah. Reinterpret it. And continue to look for other examples. Yeah, one example is not enough.
I think that's a great example, and I think that illustrates that distinction between imitation and copying.
Yeah. Cool. All right, you want to see some of my notes?
Yes, tell me.
Okay, so to bring this back again, so this is about a week ago. I think I pinged you on Twitter, right? It was like, hey. Yeah, I'm going to do this. Do you want to talk about it in a week and see what happens? So I tried to pay attention to the world around me and assign or notice when something seemed unusual and what it might mean. So there was a couple of different things going on there, and I don't always necessarily know what they mean. Just recorded it. So this first one, and I was glad you said noticing things with all of your senses. We tend to see mostly with our eyes, but there are other things that you should be thinking about if you want to kind of run the same experiment. And so
other things, thinking about and feeling.
Yeah.
Some sense making you can't make sense of with just the thinking mind.
That's true. And some of these I haven't meditated on or thought about deeply or let them sink in so much. This is mostly just very cursory kind of, and there's not a ton. So, but the first one being the first day I was thinking about this, I just had lunch at McDonald's sort of randomly. And something that struck me as just very odd was the smell of the napkins themselves. I know.
What do they smell like?
I couldn't tell, but it was almost like a perfume of some kind. Like it smelled very human, or like very, I don't know. Like if I almost like I would smell this walking through a crowd or something like that. I'm not sure, but it seemed very prescient and very like, and it's definitely also one of those things, like smell specifically. You know, you can smell something and have almost an immediate recollection of where it is that you smelled it before, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you almost always have those experiences the second time, meaning you have some experience and then it triggers this kind of recollection. And in this case, it's gonna happen backwards. Meaning I noticed the smell without knowing where I'm going to smell it again, but I know I'm going to, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the first one. And then I found this crazy sort of like thing on the internet. Yeah, of course. Like why? Of course you'd find something weird like that on the internet. It's called. Well, you know what? I'm not exactly. I'm not gonna give details, mostly because I don't really. It's not important. The details are not important. I found this little thing on the internet, and it was putting a lot of meaning into basically random numbers. Okay. So there's this number, and people are like, hey, these numbers in the middle of this random number are very significant because of these reasons. And of course, you get two camps. This is amazing. This is how did this happen? This is interesting and cool. And then as soon as you get that, you have all the people that are like, well, actually, this number should happen by chance every blah, 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 you know, and they just totally kill it with whatever the statistics are. And the thing is, they're not wrong. They're absolutely correct that this number should appear randomly, or like it should appear like once a year is what the prediction was. And you can go on and find other examples of it. And then to the most extreme on the other side, you know, people were throwing out time travelers and AI and all kinds of sort of things that aren't real. So for me, I kind of took this sort of middle line with this thing that happened sort of pseudo randomly. I mean, it had some information there, and there's this group of people that are starting to coordinate around it. Now they're using it as almost like a marketing ploy, right? Because you've got this sort of mystic thing to get people in that are interested in sort of these, or wanting to believe sort of thing. And then the idea is to just get enough people together to create a project that has some useful output for the world. And that I find, you know, that's good. I think that's fine. But every time I come across something like this, I always get the sense of, well, maybe it is real. You know, maybe there are aliens from outer space or whatever. And I don't think it's not bad to think those things, or at least even to think about them deeply. But once you start to see ways in which that is probably not the case, it's time to reorient. And for me, that happened in the midst of conversations with other people about this particular topic. So, second example, randomness, finding meaning in random numbers.
Finding meaning in random numbers, yeah. It kind of reminds me of this idea of killing your darlings, like the belief systems and the things that you really, really want to believe.
Yeah.
Periodically looking at them and then just killing them. If you're not prepared for that, I mean, that can be really disorienting. But it really is just kind of like opening yourself up for new possibility. Like, if I'm so attached to this particular thing being true, what is it stopping me from noticing something else over here that might contradict with it or something?
Yeah. And it's also good to be aware that in times where making sense is difficult, critical thinking and how to do that is very important. It's not everything. It's actually not even close to everything, but you need at least that to not fall off a cliff.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Okay. This is a good one. So the offsite that I was on for Urbit, was actually called Escape. It was like the name of the retreat.
Mhm.
And as I was driving home from the site, a song on the radio called "Your Next Escape" came on, and I was just like, "What is my next? I don't know." But it immediately caught my attention as being like relevant to the experience I just had, and I didn't choose that song. I'd never heard it before.
Right.
So in this way, this would be something in your environment, kind of rhyming with the experience you just had.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the last one, and this is the one I have no idea what it means. So as I was dropping off the rental car, you're supposed to put gas in it before you take off.
Mm-hmm.
So I just let it do its thing, and when I came back to the thing, it said it was exactly $14, and it was exactly 14 gallons to 2 decimal places. And I've been driving for 20 something odd years, and I've never had that happen. It's never been even in either one of those numbers. Like maybe it has, but I just didn't realize it, right?
Yeah.
But and then it was using the same, like there was a number in there that was the same, and all this other stuff. So of course I don't know. I don't have any reason to believe it means anything other than, well, that's interesting, but it definitely caught my attention.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. That's cool. If anything, at like just the most minimum level of being like tuning yourself to synchronicities, you can start to have fun.
You really can, especially if you don't take it like, again, like I was saying, you need to have some critical thinking about what it is, meaning it's not nothing and it's not everything.
Right. Yeah.
Something else. Right.
Yeah.
And what you were saying there for people who are watching this, his name is Kirby Surprise, right? Which is a great name.
Yeah.
Wrote a book called Synchronicity, which we've both read, and it's a great book. But a lot of these kind of experiences happen, and he talks about them. He brings them up from a kind of psychological perspective, but also from a more, I guess you'd call them almost like shamanistic perspective, like what these can mean towards and how you live your life, that kind of thing. So it's a great book, highly recommend it.
Yeah. Yeah. The gist of it is basically just like what you pay attention to matters.
Yeah, totally. And you won't see it if you don't pay attention.
Right.
And it's really true. Like for a while, I was trying to pay attention to these kind of phenomena, and I could for a while, but it tends to go by the wayside. But I think it's an interesting practice.
Mm-hmm.
Like I really do think it's a practice.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So what is this? Is this journaling practice or noticing practice? Do you think it's something that you're going to continue?
Like journaling it? I don't know, maybe, because I did end up writing some stuff about some weird stuff that I'd seen while I was writing even. So when I was writing this, so remember that idea that I had earlier about like when you're all looking at the same memes and then you sort of slowly diverge, and then there's something happens after that.
Yeah.
As I was writing that, I misspelled 2 particular words, like, and those 2 words were both movie titles. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at it, and you know how it highlights them, right? So I'm looking at these, and I'm like, oh, these are both movies. These are both pop culture references. And I just found this weird sort of like, I don't know what it was, but it was fun to write it down and then try to, even while you were writing some of this stuff down, see the synchronicities.
Yeah. What if we talk again in a week and you've like created all these stories around the numbers that you saw, and they were like profoundly religious, and you were changing the direction in your life?
Yeah. Well, one of the funny thing is, I got into geocaching years ago, like, because it's actually just a lot of fun to just monkey around outside and find stuff that's either buried or hidden or whatever. But sometimes you'd find some really weird, like that, like numerological, like little Easter eggs. And sometimes I try to figure them out, and sometimes it's just like, I don't have time for that. Like little puzzles.
Yeah.
But maybe I'll do that. If I come up with something really good, I'll bury it in the ground somewhere and let somebody else dig it up.
But did you notice that you were paying attention to different kinds of things? Or was it basically just like trying to maintain open awareness?
Yeah, I think so. But what you just said there is sort of like that's almost like what you do in meditation, which is to like observe your perception or observe your mind or something like that, which then immediately, and one should think, well, could you observe that? Maybe you could. I don't know. I've never tried. It's hard enough just to try to observe your own consciousness. But I think it's more like you always have, maybe it's like this. It's like, your attention is what it is and pointed where it's at, but you have to make a lot of decisions about what to disregard all the time. And so if you have like a little, like in software debugging, you can like put a breakpoint. So if you put a breakpoint right there, whereas when you're trying to dismiss things, and then you just add some little extra logic of like, what's the meaning here, or whatever that thing is that's going to allow you to pay attention to something that you would normally not. That's kind of what it feels like. It's not like I'm doing anything different, that I'm just trying to break my attention differently.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's not super hard, really. It's not like I'm doing it all the time, but it doesn't take a lot of work.
Right.
Yeah. Also helps if you have something to write it down with, because otherwise you will forget. So I did. I wrote it down on my phone. So like if people want to do it, write it down. And it's probably going to be in your phone because that's the only thing we carry with us all over the place.
Yeah. I record little voice memos.
I did that a few times, and I have some really old ones, and they sound just amazing now. But I should probably do that. I've thought about doing that, I should say. I couldn't quite get my thoughts together, but it's a good practice too. Yeah.
So what else? What else for signs and tribulations?
Well, let's see. There was another idea that I wrote down that's not exactly related, but I still wrote it down on the same piece of paper. It was a new word that I learned. It's called hyperstition. And have you heard this word?
I have, but I forget what it means.
Yeah, so it's related to superstition. So superstition are things when you see signs and you see things in your environment, and you create either rituals or practices to try to make those things happen again, but your actions don't actually have any bearing on the existence of objective reality. So this is like common. I mean, everybody knows what a superstition is, walking around ladders and right. Jumping up and down 3 times and turning to make the rain fall or something like that. Occasionally it will, just because of sort of like random chance. So a hyperstition it works similarly, meaning your actions now bring about a future concrete reality, but it doesn't exist now. So a great example of this would be Mars. All of humanity, it seems like, is talking about this, right? We're building towards it. We're thinking about it, but it's not real. But the fact that we keep doing this makes it real. So it's almost like landing on Mars has as a self-fulfilling prophecy, or it's the same idea, kind of, maybe a little bit different, but it's you can almost like visualize it as like a backwards movement in time. Like once we conceive of something that can be made real, and we keep pushing towards it because we know it can be, and then eventually we do make it real, or that thing was almost like working through us to make itself actualized. That kind of thing. Which is just a trippy thought altogether. Like I really do like to, and I think that's a great attitude to have when you're trying to build something in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause what, yeah, it's an interesting question. Like if you can't quite create the mental image of it being real, like if you can't fully believe that it's possible,
Yeah.
Then that'll affect your, it has to affect your behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
You won't go full balls to the wall unless you're like, this is the thing that I believe possible.
Yeah. And another very, very mundane example of this would be going on vacation. So just think about, like, how does this process actually happen? So you get some idea in your head at some point in time, I want to go out, on an African safari. I want to do that. I've never done it. It's going to be good. For me, this is probably be a 20+ hour plane ride and multiple weeks and, all of that stuff that's required. Well, how does that come into existence, into being? Me and the people around me talking, shifting resources, but all of these things is just me talking, or, some expression of me talking, booking flights and booking accommodations and all this other stuff. And it's all been sort of like prearranged. And then one day, I don't go to work. Nobody goes to school because all the kids are with me, right? And we're 15,000 miles away, and that's fine. Like, nobody bats an eye because it's vacation, and that's like a normal thing. But it came kind of pulled forward in time, or pulled backwards in time, I guess, something like that. And this has always struck me as very weird. Like, you could just sort of, if you talked about this thing long enough, nobody would find it weird that you were like 5,000 miles away for 2 weeks or whatever.
Yeah.
They're not surprised when you show up at the plane.
Yeah.
This person who you've never met and will never meet.
Yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road, is changing other people's reality.
Yeah.
And their perceptions. Like, you can have a amazing vision of a thing that you want to accomplish, but until it starts affecting like your relational field, like, let's say you need to raise money.
Yeah.
You're going to have to change their perception of reality to believe that it's a good idea to give you money.
Yeah, especially if it's a lot of money.
Yeah. So Fantasyland is the realm where you aren't actually moving it out into a relational field. You're just imagining yourself in this other possibility, but not actually speaking it into existence, by engaging with other people and making shit happen.
Right. It seems so mundane, but a lot of times, sometimes the most mundane things, if you really stop and think about them, are quite remarkable. Yeah. All right. Anything else on your end?
I don't think so. I feel pretty complete. I think we just had a really great conversation.
As always.
Yeah.
And we did it live.
Yeah. Yeah. People will find it. Just post the link after.
Okay. All right, Collin. Well, take care, my friend, and we'll catch you again soon.
Okay. Thanks for having me, man.
Bye.